Welcome to the YourTown television program, sponsored by the Naval Postgraduate School Foundation, where we bring you in this segment interesting faculty, students, and personnel assigned to the area and what they're doing. And today, we have a special guest with us, the commander of the Naval Support Activity Monterey, Captain Rich Coyote Wiley. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. This is an honor.
Well, you have a fantastic career behind you, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, your mother didn't give you the name Coyote. So tell us a little bit about the honorable call sign tradition of the United States Naval Aviator.
Call signs, I will go back to World War II, or at least as far as Naval and Marine Corps aviation. So whenever I say Naval Aviation, it's Naval and Marine Corps aviation. Call signs used to be a part of the tactical requirement.
Oh. So
when they flew, if you said Jeff Kline or Rich Wiley is up and flying, the enemy would know who you were.
Right.
If I said JK or Coyote was up in the air, it would hide who the pilot was. So you assume that, or you figured that the enemy knew the strengths, the weaknesses, knew the pilots they were going against, and if you were able to cloud that a little more, you would maintain a tactical advantage.
So who picked these call signs?
You do not pick the call sign. If I pick the call sign, somebody's bound to change it. To ask where the call sign came from, it in tradition, it means a beer, and over a beer, I will tell you,
Okay.
but not until that is divvied up. But somewhere along the line, I've been given a lot of call signs. None of them stuck. And obviously with Wiley Coyote, that's the one that has stuck. So.
Well, I kind of like it, so that's...
so did my parents.
Yeah. And speaking of your parents, you're a local boy. You're coming home after a career. So you went to school in Greenfield, is that right? Or is that where you're from?
Greenfield Elementary.
Oh, Greenfield Elementary,
yeah,
right.
Go Raiders, and then King City Mustangs, 1982. So
is
go
that
Mustangs.
right? You were a Mustang.
My dad still lives in the same house he and my mom were married in over 60 years, nearly 60 years ago in the Oroseco.
Fantastic.
So I get to go home a lot, and it's fun to see them.
Well, I personally met your parents. I think they're fantastic people. So when you were here as a Mustang, what did you do in school?
I did, King City Mustang, so grew up on a farm. So fifth-generation farmers here in the Salinas Valley. And I will tell you, some of the most genuine, bright, successful people farm, cattle ranch, grow grapes, make wines in the Salinas Valley. So being able to come back and maintain, get back in touch with friends that, with the Navy, I've moved more than 15 times, driven more than 15 times across the United States.
Yeah. And
not one of those have been to Monterey. So not that I haven't visited, but the chance to come back here I'm honored that Admiral Lindsay, who was my boss in San Diego, and Admiral Jackson, who's in charge of installations, had the confidence to put me in as commanding officer of this base. It's wonderful to be back.
Well, we're going to get to some of those responsibilities as base commander and some of the opportunities that the civilian community may have to interface with the support activity and the Naval Postgraduate School. Before that, let's talk a little bit about your career. So what made you join the Navy? You just told me you were fifth generation.
Not one naval officer, not one military officer. So it's somewhere along the line as you're growing up and you're a retired naval officer yourself, you're either attracted to it or you're not. And it's not to say my brothers would no more than fly to the moon to join the military, and there's nothing wrong with that. But something attracted me to naval aviation. And when I was applying, I was working at the same time applying back to business schools, having worked in the financial industry for 2 years. And this was during the 80s, so the height of the Reagan-Bush era. So a lot of my friends who I graduated college with were going back, working for the investment houses, wherever, and then going back to business school, law school, doing one of those things. I, too, was on that same track. But I had a couple of good friends that I played lacrosse with at Berkeley that had gone into naval aviation. And I maintained contact with them, and just something fascinates you. You're either drawn to it or you're not.
Right.
And I was drawn to it. And at the same time, I'd gotten word back that I had been waitlisted at one of the business schools I was applying to. The Navy had asked me if I wanted to come fly to them. And I figured I could always go back and get my master's. I can't always fly for the Navy, and I have not regretted it once. It's been a great decision.
You are a unique attrition, and somewhat because you got your degree at Berkeley, and then did you go to Aviation Officer Candidate School after that?
I did. Go Bears. And it was 1989 is when I signed on the dotted line. I was delayed because I was the first of, and I'll say RIF, it's a reduction in force. So we were coming off the 80s and the Reagan push for the 600 ship Navy. We were scaling down some of the air wings. So it was getting harder and harder to get into Aviation Officer Candidate School. So I was delayed by a few months and stuck with it. June of 1990. I flew out of San Francisco and into Pensacola, which is where Aviation Officer Candidate School. Two different climates. So fairly cool in San Francisco and not so much in Pensacola. And I was babysat for about 4 months by a United States Marine Corps Staff Sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Jesus Jimenez, United States Marine Corps, who I still know to this day.
That's fantastic.
And it's been I would say it was a wonderful experience.
It was a growing experience.
It was a life-changing one.
Yeah, absolutely. So you became a naval flight officer first,
I did.
and then you transitioned to become a naval aviator. So explain first, what's the difference between the mission commander of a naval flight officer and the naval aviator who's in charge of that aircraft if it's a single ship, and also the mission commander? Tell us a little bit the difference between the
Navy
two.
pilot is in direct control of the aircraft. So for
Right.
me, when I say a naval aviator, it's a Naval Marine Corps carrier aviator. So I'll speak to carrier aviation, but is in direct control of the aircraft and is responsible for getting on and off the carrier. I started out as an NFO, which is a naval flight officer. I flew 5 years as an A6 intruder BN. Loved it.
So before we go too fast, A6 is an aircraft that was originally designed for nighttime and all-weather bombing, going power
Medium
projection,
attack.
and a BM stands for Bombardier
Navigator.
Right, so you're sitting right next to the pilot as a mission
I was
commander.
sitting to the right of the pilot, and you can say nowadays it's very similar in an F-18F Rhino
Right.
as the weapons system operator. So the
got it.
pilot, the reason the A6 was so successful, it was medium attack. Its sole purpose was attack. It was offensive. It's the reason the carrier is out there, for power projection. So I did 2.5 cruises as an A6 intruder BN. And responsible for the weapon system, for employing those weapons on that A6, as well as the expendables, which is your raw gear, which helps you defeat the enemy air defenses. Responsible for the employing of that. The pilot is responsible for getting us on and off the aircraft carrier, which was phenomenal at times. For getting just the teamwork atmosphere and getting into the target area and getting out of it. As you said, you look for these teams that do it so well. Football, baseball, or whatever the sport, and those who can carry on that activity for us in the A6.
Right.
And a lot of times you fly with that guy so close and so much that you're able to communicate without having to talk. And once you've seen that, you usually hit that during the middle of deployment.
Right.
You're there.
Yeah. So the A6, and then what did you transition to next?
Transition to pilot. So I went back through the flight training program.
Right.
And went back through flight school and ended up CQing carrier qualling in the T-45 Goshawk. And then I reported to VAW 120 to fly the E-2 Hawkeye, which is the radar dish.
So what does an E-2 Hawkeye do? You say it was a radar dish. It's got a big radar on top of it. Right?
Dual prop, radar dish, the fleet replacement squadrons on the East Coast. I was assigned to VAW 113, the Black Eagles, at a Point Magoo. That's what you would call my nugget tour, my first carrier aviator tour, naval aviator tour. And that went on for about 2.5 years. Had a great experience with wonderful professional dudes. And the E2 is responsible. It's the eyes and ears of the carrier strike group. So it could look out so many miles and be able to see who's flying around, who's on the surface, being able to control all assets, specifically naval air that are
I was going to say, it's more than just eye and ears, it's also the brain, because it's controlling many parts of the air battle or air search areas as well.
So it comprises 2 pilots who are up in front, the pilot and the co-pilot, and then you have 3 NFOs in the back who are your combat systems operators. So, and do a fantastic job.
So you said you deployed in that tour?
I did, and that was with Carrier Wing 14 on the USS Abraham Lincoln, and that was to the Western Pacific and the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf.
Okay, and then what was your next airplane?
My next airplane, I transitioned over to the carrier COD, the C-2 Greyhound.
And that's the aircraft that actually links the carrier with the shore, bringing both passenger and cargo.
With fleet logistics, and an Army runs on its stomach. A carrier battle group will run on those critical supplies, and a lot of the supply, the replenishment for a carrier strike group comes by sea, and you need it to. But there are those items, those people, specifically dignitaries and sailors, others that you need to get to the boat right off the bat. Canopies for fighters that need to come off, and you have a hurricane coming on the East Coast, which we delivered 2 days before the hurricane was supposed to hit, or that aircraft would have had to stay on the boat. We end up getting it out there, and that aircraft comes up and ends up flying off on time. Same thing happens day to day, twice a day during cruise.
Now, then you transitioned to another aircraft, or tell us.
I did not.
You
I was
ever
in
sell that one?
that led to the C2 was where my command tour was, and
Right.
that was down in San Diego, out of North Island with
Right.
VRC 30, the providers, and had an absolutely fantastic tour.
Yeah, but the next phases of your operational side, you became an air boss. So what's the air boss, and did you get to fly other airplanes? when
I
you
did
that?
not. You don't have a lot of time to fly.
No,
as
you
the
don't.
air
You're not,
boss.
as the air boss, you don't fly. It's
You do not.
oxymoron.
You get to you are looking outside the window as the kid who can't go outside today, and seeing all your friends play. The air boss is responsible for all flight operations for not only the aircraft carrier but the carrier strike group. So ironically, the deputy dean of students, Paul Gump Rasmussen, was my mini boss at the
Oh,
time.
is that right?
And he is now here at MPS as the deputy dean of students. So we've been able to hook up, and it's been great. But I would be up in what we call the tower, the Eagle's Nest, at the
Right.
top of the tower on the aircraft carrier. And flight operations will go on anywhere from 12, 14 to 18 hours a day. And you spend 18 hours, and I talked about in the A6, the silent communication that goes on with somebody who works with somebody day in and day out for that long. And Gump and I were able to communicate without even having to talk to somebody, because I knew what he was doing, what I would expect from him, and vice versa from me.
Well, you've had a fascinating career. We can stick on that, but I wanted to go one intermediate step before we talk about Monterey, and that is China Lake. You actually were the mayor or the base commander of that very large facility. Tell us some of the things that occurred at China Lake with you as the commander.
And which is where I flew my last aircraft, which was the F-18 Super Hornet, and that was a good friend of mine was the commanding officer of EX-9 who I flew with, and it was an honor. I mean, I can't say it enough on being able to go back and train in another aircraft. But China Lake, I would usually brief people that as I was welcoming them to base.
Right.
And China Lake is 1.2 million acres on the eastern side of the Sierras in the Mojave Desert. And most people, as they crest the hill going into the town of Ridgecrest, which is what, just on the outside of NAVSUPACT China Lake.
Right.
It's like, well, what's your first impression? They're like, oh my gosh, I'm in the middle of nowhere. And I said, do you know what goes on here? Because to the east of China Lake, I said China Lake was 1.2 million acres. The National Training Center for the Army,
Right.
Fort Irwin, is
Right.
800,000 acres. And that's where their final workup exercises prior to their deployment, their box hops, that's where they train for infiltration of cities and everything that goes on with the area that they're going to go into. That occurs just the other side. And to the south is Edwards Air Force Base, which is where the Air Force flight
Does
test
all
center
their
is.
trainings, right.
And they utilize the ranges up at China Lake. So China Lake overhead is over 20,000 square miles. It's nearly 3,000 square miles of land space with 500 miles of perimeter and 300 miles of fence line. And what goes on at China Lake, what's my responsibility? It'll be the same as at Monterey. It's infrastructure, safety and security. You have encroachment, those who are looking to move the barriers in or encroaching on the Navy's ability to do operations, as well as public outreach. So those were the things that and much like I'm responsible for here every day, those will appear on my desk or on my dashboard at any one time. What happens at China Lake, NAVAir,
Right. Yeah.
it's a test base, so we call it RDT&E. So all the squadrons that are down there are flying test exercises for NOC-WD.
Right.
And NOC-WD is doing some wonderful things. I'll start a brief with a picture of an aircraft carrier if I'm talking out in town, and it's a loaded flight deck. And it was a picture taken from the telescope of a submarine. And a tac sub skipper, who's a good friend of mine, was actually trying to target me during one of the exercises we were having with them.
Right.
But it would be a loaded flight deck, and I would look at that and say, and to the audience I'm briefing, I'm like, do you know the reason that carrier exists? It exists. It's 4.5 acres because that's the United States, and it's for power projection. It's also for diplomacy. So I will say, it usually you come with a bag of carrots and sticks. And that thing has both.
Yes, that's true.
And I will usually say, do you know, when I was at China Lake, do you know the percent of weapons that were researched, developed, tested, or evaluated at China Lake, what that percentage is for those weapons that are on that aircraft carrier? And not many people know. And I said, over 95%. That's what goes on at China Lake. Because in the middle of the Mojave Desert, you can't do that in the middle of Monterey.
No, you certainly
can't do that in the middle of San Diego or Los Angeles. That all goes on down at China Lake. So some wonderful work in a very hard area to live.
And then you came to Monterey, and I think a mayor is the right analogy, right? As far as infrastructure, security, response, that sort of thing.
It's been used before. It's working with great people.
Right.
Every day. So to say that I have a hand in any of the solutions, I would like to say I do, but it's people who have been here for my deputy commander, Pete Dawson, with over 30 years of service, has been in Monterey nearly 20 years. I can't say enough about that. There is not a day that goes by that I don't tap into one of the people on my staff and say, what can I, what do we do here for Monterey? I asked, what do we do in China Lake? What do you do why does Monterey exist? And before there's a China Lake, before there's any of these other places, there's the education, there's the professional knowledge that can only come from a place like Monterey. And last spring we had at our March and June graduation ceremonies, we had 10 friends that visited, they and their wives. And 9 of those 10 had gotten degrees from Monterey.
Wow.
7 of them were working in China Lake, in Ridgecrest. The other 2 of them were up at Fallon, and another one was still back at Pax River. That's the reach of a place like Monterey. You look at the business schools, you look at defense analysis, you look at physics, you look at all the professional education that's going on here. You cannot say it enough, much like the Secretary of the Navy said that last week. You cannot overemphasize the importance of Monterey and education for our professional military. Now,
there are activities that occur on the base where we invite the public, or maybe open up to the public. Because of security reasons, we can't always do that, of course. It would be wonderful to have an open campus, I think, but that's, since 9/11, that's not realistic. Can you cover some of those events that the public can participate in, and how can they do that?
When I was growing up, I still remember concerts on the lawn. And it's not like we came to them every year at Memorial Day.
Right.
But having grown up in the Salinas Valley, I can still remember my mom and dad bringing us over here. Either had friends at Fort Ord who invited us, or for whatever reason, still remember driving on, seeing the Hotel Del Monte and hearing the Pops or the Monterey Symphony.
Right.
So, and I will tell you, part of my 4 pillars, if you will, and it's just a CO thing, but safety and security will always be my primary responsibility for the space every day. Infrastructure, keeping not only the Del Monte up, but also those buildings, each one historically marked, but having been built in the 50s, those require 3M, those require care, those require maintenance to keep up. Encroachment is another. How do we reduce our signature for water and energy? And the last is public outreach.
Right.
Doing interviews like these, espousing the great things that are going on at Monterey, but also opening up the base so it doesn't feel like Wonka. So somebody said a few weeks ago, it's like, well, it's great that you relax the standards. I haven't relaxed anything.
No, that's right.
I can't relax the standards.
Right.
But I'm not letting the things you can't do get in the ways of the things we can.
Right. Right.
So with that, we do have a number of open base events. Those come with extra security measures I can't go into.
Of course.
But the Concerts on the Lawn is one. We have our graduations. We have NPS Day, which was incredibly successful, of which NPS and the provost deserve so much credit for bringing nearly 1,500 students, high school, elementary, junior high students onto the base.
Absolutely.
Making science cool. Everybody saw what happened with SpaceX yesterday. Oh my gosh, I'm a simple pilot. What went into launching that thing and then having those engines come back on that spot. I know I don't have that talent. It's great to see the next generation of those who do. We're potentially at NPS last December.
Well, Captain Rich Wiley, thank you very much for your service and for what you're doing here now in Monterey. And welcome back home, local boy. We're glad to have you here. And we appreciate you being on YourTown television program.
Thanks for having me. Go Mustangs.
All right. And thank you and all the Mustangs for joining us here on the YourTown television program, sponsored by the Naval Postgraduate School Foundation. Until next time, I'm your host, Jeff Kline, when we'll talk with other MPS faculty and students who are doing interesting and exciting things.